What is the single most unsettling thing you've heard about this subject?
The malevolence, the potential malevolence of whatever this phenomenon is. So I do a podcast with a guy called Bryce Zabel called Need to Know, which I'll also shamelessly plug.
Great podcast, by the way.
But one of the last episodes we did, we talked about the evidence suggesting that, contrary to the happy clappy benevolent notion that all UAPs are well intentioned and kind, which is, I guess you could say, the Dr. Stephen Greer argument that whatever this is, it's no threat to humanity. There is actually evidence to show that people have been hurt by UAPs and that they have engaged offensively, not only with military, but with individual civilians. And I talked last week about a case where a good friend of mine, Damien Knott, who's an Australian experiencer and UAP investigator, he suffered terrible apparent radiation injuries suffered by close-up exposure to a UAP. And it's interesting because I've been told stuff. I did a piece in my documentary about cattle mutilations, which was almost tangential to the issue of UAPs, but I did a first edition of the documentary in, I think it was June, July last year for Channel 7 Australia. And what happened was I got phone calls from all over Australia from veterinary surgeons, like well-qualified, university-educated, postdoctorate veterinary surgeons, some of whom have actually worked at senior levels in government in Australia. And they were telling me consistently that there was a really anomalous phenomenon of mutilations of cattle, and on some occasions, animals like kangaroos. Quite weird surgical incisions into these animals where specific organs had been removed in a way that they would not be able to replicate, even with the most advanced cutting machinery that we now have at our disposal for modern surgery. Bloodless surgery. I think the most dramatic one was a very senior veterinary surgeon who's actually served at a national level on a veterinary body, advising government on issues relating to animal husbandry. He rang me out of the blue and he insisted on anonymity, but he allowed me to read his autopsy reports and look at his photographs. And he was called out to look at a whole lot of dead animals on a farm that had died in really unusual ways, and they'd all had organs and limbs, parts of their lips, ears, tongue removed in ways that he could not explain. And then on the way out of the property, he noticed a dead cow by the front gate. And he said, "Oh, what's the story with that one?" And they said, "Well, it looks like it's just died because there's no external injury. So we didn't tell you about it because we don't think it's related to the UAPs that we saw over the property a few nights ago." Anyway, he did an autopsy on the ground right there and there. And as you know, I've forgotten how many stomachs cows have. I think it's three. And they all sit on top of one another. And apparently, when you do an autopsy on a cow, you have to lift each individual stomach out. It's a huge, messy job. But, the last stomach is right up against the rib cage. And to get to it, you've got to lift out the other stomachs. It's a ghoulish job to do in an autopsy. So he lifts out the first stomach. Nothing there. There's no signs of any contusion, no signs of any surgery. Lifts out the second stomach. Nothing there. And then he gets to the hole where the third stomach should be. I've seen the autopsy report. There's nothing there. Whatever it was had removed the third stomach of this animal without leaving a drop of blood. And it had essentially surgically removed the third stomach of this cow in a way that he said was just anatomically impossible. Like he was the one who breached the stomach lining of this animal with his scalpel to do the autopsy. There was no discernible invasive injury that could explain how something as large as a cow's stomach could have been removed. This is a creditable scientist that has advised the Australian government on issues related to animal husbandry. And he said to me, "Ross, I'm as perplexed by this phenomenon as you are." But he said, "It's real." And he says, "I'm going to put you on to a whole series of other scientists who've had the same experience." And these scientists have been very careful with me. They've all insisted on anonymity because they're worried about the ridicule and the stigma that's attached to the phenomenon. But whatever it is, it's killing animals. And as we discussed on the podcast, the Need to Know podcast last weekend, there is actually evidence to show that people have been killed. There's an incident in England where a man was found on top of a coal slag heap, and if the killer had walked up the side of the coal slag heap, you would see footsteps. And the report, the coronial report investigating this death, shows that there were no discernible footprints. But this poor man's mutilated body that clearly showed signs of the most appalling torture and exsanguination and removal of certain organs, he'd been mutilated by something that had dropped him in a crowded city on the top of a coal slag pile. Then you've got things like the Colares incidents in Brazil, where numerous Brazilian villages described being hit with beams of light and suffering terrible burns. And in some cases, some people were actually killed.
We were just reading an article about this physician who had been commissioned to write a report on the physiological effects of close encounters of the third and fourth kind. And he said that like 1 in 10 die within 5 years, and the remaining suffer what can only be described as the same symptoms as the Havana syndrome.
Is this Dr. Kit Green you're talking about?
Is it, Rob?
I believe it was Kit Green's.
Yeah.
Kit Green's report.
Yeah. I mean, Kit Green's the former head of the CIA's Weird Desk. He's the guy that used to work in the Central Intelligence Agency, handling the weird shit that no other part of the agency wanted to look at, essentially.
Right. Yeah.
And you know, he's a highly credentialed, extremely well-respected doctor who has done a lot of work. And yes, you're right. He's been doing work very recently into the Havana syndrome. Probably, he hasn't said which agency, but again, probably at the request of the CIA. But there's a bit of ambiguity about what he and another doctor, Professor Gary Nolan from Stanford, have been talking about. They've been doing a collaboration looking at this issue. But in some cases, people who have described close-up experiences with UAPs, with the phenomenon, have been observed by Gary Nolan, Professor Gary Nolan at Stanford University, to have enhanced caudate putamen in their basal ganglia of their brain, which essentially is a positive thing in many ways. It suggests that there might actually be a genetic difference for people who are more prone to having these experiences of contact with the phenomenon. But what Kit Green has also talked about, and Gary Nolan has also alluded to this, is that as well as the subset of Havana syndrome patients who've died from exposure to what appears to be some kind of beam technology by a state-sponsored actor, probably the Russians, the interesting thing is that there are also people who've died in a similar way from exposure to UAPs close up. And just to come back to the question that you asked me, you know, what's the most sinister and disturbing thing? I've spoken to people in the defense and intelligence community who've admitted to me that they have had weird paranormal experiences where after their exposure to what they would call, if you like, a classic UAP encounter,
right,
they've had, I suppose you could call it, ghost-like experiences where they've, I mean, some of this is on the record, actually. Some of these people have spoken to George Knapp and Colm Kelleher for their book, Colm Kelleher, for their book called Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. And there's a thing called the hitchhiker effect, where people who'd been to the Skinwalker Ranch, particularly people who'd been at the sharp end of combat, they were followed home by the phenomenon.